It feels like mystery, but it's all a part of God's great history.
No creed but Christ.
This was my best decision.
This is my life.
My love goes deeper with age. We've got a book of history. Now we can turn the
creed but
page.
Christ. This was my best decision. This is my life. My love goes deeper with age. We've got a book of history. Now we can turn the page.
Welcome to the inaugural Disciples History podcast from Disciples of Christ Historical Society. I am Rick Lowry, president of DCHS, the Historical Society, and I am very happy that our inaugural episode is going to be with my pastor, the Reverend Terri Hord Owens, the General Minister and President of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in the United States and Canada. And thank you, Terri, for opening us up. And welcome to Disciples History Podcast, which is a name that, I fretted over and I finally came up with this brilliant and clever title for. So welcome and thank you for being with us.
Oh, thank you, Rick. It's a real honor, and I'm excited about what this podcast series will do and the ways in which it will help us all learn more about all the stories in our church. So congratulations on this, and I'm honored to be your first guest.
Thank you very much. It is our hope that we will record these things on a fairly frequent basis. And that they will be useful for discussion groups in churches, Sunday school conversations, as well as just personal edification. And we're going to work with this to present it both in video and audio format. And we have wonderful musical intro and exit and interlude from J.J. Williams, who is at Shepherd's Park Christian Church. I think that's right, in the Washington D.C. area.
Oh, that's great!
I know it's just God has blessed our church so richly with such amazing talent, and I am very happy that Will Stock is helping produce this podcast, and I want to express my gratitude to him. And I'll just jump in, Terri, with some questions for you.
Sure.
Obviously, you became the General Minister and President at a very important and challenging time for our nation and for the church. And I just wanted to start off by asking what you see as a couple or three of the key challenges and opportunities that are facing us as a church today.
Well, there's sort of pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, right? And because I was coming into office, one of the challenges that has faced the church for a long time, right? That people see as a problem. And it's not just something that affects disciples, but mainline Christianity for many years was declining, both the number of congregations and the number of members, and the donations across our church to Disciples Mission Fund. All those things were named as issues and concerns about how do we rebuild the church. And this is work that no one person can do, but that we all must do together. And in my first 2.5 years before the pandemic hit, I was able to just get out and travel and spend a lot of time with our congregations and in various regions. And I think there are a couple of things that are really important. One is simply a matter of our connection to our movement.
Yeah.
and how our congregations identify them as disciples. We have a lot of congregations, unfortunately, that have a chalice on their door or on their sign,
Right.
and maybe they have communion every week. Although, as you know, not all of our congregations have communion every week, but it's what the table represents to us, not the frequency that makes us, disciples. And we have congregations that are disconnected from that. And we also have a lot of new disciples. I was one of those new disciples when I was 20 years old, loving the congregation where my family had joined, but not really having a sense at that time of the import of and the vastness of what this church was connected to. And it wasn't really until I went to divinity school that I understood how disciple my home congregation was, and what I was really a part of. So I think that issue of connection is very important. And also, I think the issue of spiritual grounding is really important. Many of our concerns have come out of our institutional presence, our numbers. How many members do we have? How much money are we bringing in? And not a focus on the spiritual foundation upon which we build ourselves as followers of Jesus Christ. I will always remember how my predecessor, your beloved spouse, Sharon Watkins, when she began her tenure as general minister and president, she had an initiative, 10,000 disciples praying. And I remember saying, that's the ticket right there. We have to remember that we are followers of Jesus Christ. We're not a 501c3 organization. So I think we do have this issue of connection to our movement. We always joke and say we're the best kept secret. We're almost a secret within our ranks. We think of over 3,000 congregations. Only about 1,700 of them report to the yearbook each year, at least for the past couple of years. And of those, maybe 50 to 60% actually give to DMF for one offering. So connection shows up in a lot of different ways. And so I think we have such a powerful story to tell as a movement that getting people reconnected to that is really important. And even as we plant new churches with leaders who sometimes are coming from outside our tradition, ensuring that there's enough disciples DNA, that as we plant new churches and that we pass along not only the Christian faith, but this legacy and history. We're not ones to set about orthodoxy or have creeds of faith, but there is an understanding of who we are, and the way in which we go about living out our faith that we need to pass on and educate. So I think connection, spiritual grounding and foundation, and a real rediscovery of our identity as disciples and what covenant means. Those would be the things that I would say.
What do you think of as our distinctive witness as a church as a particular community,
Mm-hmm.
Christian community within the broader Christian community?
I think one is the radical hospitality that we find in Christ at the table of the Lord. That all are welcome to the table. This is Jesus who hosts the table. There is no test of fellowship that determines who or what. If we could all if everybody could agree on that one thing, I think that might be the launching pad for the second piece. And that's part of our witness, ecumenically and even globally, to Christian unity. When I walk into spaces as the general minister and president of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, National Council of Churches, World Council of Churches, World Church Service. I remember my first trip as a member of the Central Committee when I began my tenure, and it was like word had spread. There's the new general minister and president of the disciples, and people wanted to meet me. They wanted to know who I was. because of the witness that disciples have made for so many generations. And that radical hospitality that's represented at the table, and then our real commitment to unity, that our guiding principle, as I've heard you say so eloquently, is our confession in Jesus as Lord, and our willingness to be at the table with people who may differ with us in various ways, theologically or ideologically, but we believe that the importance of being one body, it supersedes everything.
Yeah, it's not so much that the theological differences are unimportant. They're important.
Right,
They're important
right.
for us to talk about and reflect on. But the thing that holds us together, which is, I think, the really important witness of our tradition, the thing that holds us together is our common confession of Jesus Christ.
Correct.
And you kind of, when you're standing on that foundation, you know, that's the world, you know, that's the whole thing right there. And yes, we engage in these important debates and theological conversations, and we try to clarify what it means that God is incarnate in the world through Jesus Christ. You know, it is our confession of faith in Jesus that really is the foundation that holds us together.
Right.
When you walk into the room as the disciples' general minister and president, people know that that's going to be the thing that you're going to insist on.
Absolutely.
In conversation.
Yeah. I was in a meeting once where somebody said, well, we intentionally had communion for this meeting because we know that's important to you. And I said, you know, and so for another Christian to say to another Christian, it's like, that's important to you. And it gave me an opportunity to highlight what we've just shared. But I also was thinking to myself, well, isn't it important to you too? You know, and you don't want to make those judgmental calls, but it was clear that they thought, oh yeah, this is important. I think they had a slight misunderstanding of why it's important. It's not just the ritual of it.
Right.
But it did give me an opportunity to say, once again, it's not the frequency. It's the openness that's reflected at the table and the radical welcome that Jesus gives to all. That's often interesting to see how people interpret that, but it does give you an opportunity to reinterpret and clarify and open it up for them.
Yeah. I just remember one of my colleagues at Phillips, who was a New Testament, was actually a Jesus scholar. And he used to talk about certain things that were absolutely essential about the Jesus tradition and Jesus's fundamental teaching and ministry. One was free healing. Jesus just healed people. I mean, it didn't matter. They didn't have to be worthy. They didn't have to be clean. You know, so it's like it's free healing, open table fellowship. And an important element of that is free food. Everybody eats. You know, there is enough to go around for everybody. So free food, free health care, you know, and radically open table fellowship. Those are the fundamental characteristics of Jesus and his ministry. And I think disciples at our best have really just intuitively understood that. And I think that's really at the heart of what we have done in our, you know, our benevolent work and our mission and our partnerships with other churches. You know, so anyhow, I love my church.
Absolutely. And when we talk, you know, we've been talking about, you know, imagining God's limitless love. And I've been really refueled by, you know, Brueggemann's work that's now almost 50 years old in prophetic imagination. But the idea of God's limitless love for me is such a foundational theological concept, because, you know, Jesus is asked, what are the great commandments? And he says, to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. And then later he tells the disciples, love one another as I have loved you. This is how people will know that you are my disciples. Well, when we love each other, right, and we love as we love ourselves, and we love as God has loved us, as Jesus has loved us, then we do. It's interesting that you should say, there is enough. That was my mantra when I spoke
Yes.
at one of the opening rallies for the Poor People's Campaign. There is enough. And if we order both the use and distribution of our resources according to God's law of love, what Jesus calls us to, then we understand that there's enough. There will be healthcare, there will be adequate housing, there's food, there's welcome, there's fellowship, and that love for me is not just kumbaya, fuzzy sort of word. It's love, as First John calls us to, not just in word, but in deed. And so, if we love, we're working to build the beloved community. We're working to build that society where the reign of God is fully seen here on the earth. So all of those things, I think, are so disciple, right? And I think that's what the world is seeking, quite honestly. I have people tell me all the time, you guys are like, yeah. I'm like, yes, I know. We're on the right track.
I know.
We just want to be sure others know.
You anticipated a question that I was going to ask you. You've been very supportive of the Poor People's Campaign, which is being promoted by our dear friend and fellow Disciples of Christ minister. He is one of ours, the Reverend Dr. William Barber, who also is, my co-author. We wrote a book together, although he wrote most of it. But I wrote the biblical foundation kind of
right.
The Hebrew Bible part. Liz Harris wrote the New Testament part, but many of us may not know that a couple of years ago, William was named a MacArthur Genius Grant recipient in recognition of and to assist him in his very important work for social justice. So you have been very much a supporter of that work, and as you said, have spoken at various events. Why do you think the Poor People's Campaign is so important for this moment that we are in historically as a nation?
First of all, it's important to note that the General Assembly in 2017 passed a resolution very simply stating that it encouraged every expression of our church, general, regional, and congregational, to support the work of the Poor People's Campaign. It didn't lay out how that needed to be done or how expected it to be done, but that we should support and that the church should be encouraged to support it. We were the first denomination to make a formal statement of support for the Poor People's Campaign. And Dr. Barber often says that, Dr. King's own denomination, the National Baptist Convention, did not support his work. And so he feels very blessed that his church stands with him. Why? And there are about 47 state campaigns. You will find disciples in leadership in almost all of those campaigns. There are disciples working on the Poor People's Campaign staff. In fact, the executive director is one of our retired clergy, Dr. Alvin Jackson. There's so many disciples who are behind the scenes helping with this work. But the work is pretty simple. When we look at, again, this God's limitless love and who we are called to be as followers of Jesus Christ and as disciples of Christ, capital D as well as little d, making sure that we that love is reflected in building a world where there is enough. And if you look at, it's not just about marching in DC or even marching in West Virginia. There are some specific policy proposals that go along with that work. There is a biblical foundation that has been established for Christians as to why this work is important. And it also, I think, speaks to what I believe the real future of ecumenism and interfaith work must be.
Yeah.
And that's not just to sit at conciliar tables and write statements about where we agree or disagree, right? Or to spend 10 or 20 years having dialogues, and at the end we publish a report or a paper. But if we could mobilize Christians and people of many faiths around the world, and particularly in our country and even in Canada, in the US and Canada, we can have an impact. We can advocate for change in policies that will ensure that this society reflects that law of limitless love, and that we're reflections of that. So fighting poverty, when you think about how many low wealth and poor people, he's saying don't want to be called poor, healthcare, the fight against militarisms, all of these things were pillars of Dr. King's original Poor People's Campaign. But I think it's an opportunity for us to begin to understand that the work is not just worship on Sunday, and the work is not even just a food pantry or clothing or a child care center or visiting the sick and the elderly, but it's actively working for change within our society, that the gospel calls us to that too. That's why I think it's so important. Yes. And that if we can mobilize around that, and it's not even just a Christian thing, but there are a couple of imams and Rabbi Pesner, who's head of the Reformed Jewish movement, whom I've been shoulder to shoulder with in the streets on Zoom meetings. There's a great love that we all have for each other's tradition, but more importantly, a great love that we all have for the people in our society. And all of our religions have some form of compelling statement, command to take care of one another, to love one another. Yes. So that's what I think the power of this movement is. Burgerman says that the prophet needs to get inside God's imagination. And so to think about what are the solutions to the problems in our world, to think about how we reflect that limitless love, or what the reign of God really looks like on the earth. What are we to do? What's our mission focus? We have to get inside God's imagination, because as 1 Corinthians says, God uses the foolish things of the world to confuse the wise. And so God's expansive possibilities may seem beyond our ability to do it, but if we're trusting in God's ability to provide and direct, our belief in what is possible, I think, is something that the church needs to grab onto. We're often, we operate from a lack, from a spirit of lack. Well, we don't have this, we don't have that. And God is calling us to something that's so big. If we don't believe that God will provide for that, then we might as well hang up and go home. But I think that's the other thing that's really powerful, is to imagine that we can have that impact, that we can do that. God, I think, will provide for that.
Yeah, I think that our culture has become captured by the economic assumptions of scarcity of goods and services and unlimited needs and wants. And what the biblical vision is of abundance and of self limitation and giving for the sake of the abundant life of all. So the biblical witness and the economic witness that becomes sort of the governing metaphor for our culture of scarcity thinking.
Yes.
And I gotta get mine because there's not enough. Yeah. We gotta abandon that. Just let it go.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just think the Poor People's Campaign gives us a way in which to live that out collectively. I'm so proud when I see disciples participating and active and making a difference. Not just because, and again, it's not about marching in the streets. And people see a lot of that, but there's some solid theological foundation from a Christian standpoint, as well as some important public policy proposals that have been well thought out and are worthy of our reflection and worthy of our support as we live out our faith. This is one of the most important ways that we can do that.
I want to turn toward a conference that Disciples of Christ Historical Society will sponsor in Tulsa on March 18th and 19th of 2022. entitled Systemic Racism, Anti-Racism, and Reconciliation in Our Shared History and Tradition. We are thinking of this as an in-depth conversation with leading scholars of disciples' history and theology, and of the theology and history of the broader Stone Campbell religious tradition out of which our church grew, and how the ideology of white superiority and the resistance to that ideology has had an impact on our history as a church. We're also going to reflect in this conference. I mean, it's just an amazing group of people, the scholars that we have. We're going to talk about Native American issues. We're going to talk about Hispanic, Latinx relationships within our church, Asian American disciples, and of course, the great leaders like Preston Taylor and Sarah Lou Bostic, who have been so important in our history, and and the formation of the National Christian Missionary Society, and which now is the National Convocation within our overall general structure. So we're going to talk about those stories, about telling the fuller story of who we are as a church. And William Barber is gonna keynote for us on Friday night. So I'm sure he'll be real subdued in what he has to say. We just got a great group of scholars: Dr. Timothy Lee, Dr. Lisa Barnett, Dr. Leah Gunning Francis, Dr. Newell Williams, Doug Foster, President Charisse Gillette, President Nancy Pittman, yourself, Dr. Frank Thomas. I mean, it's just amazing group of people who we have who will be attending this thing. I have long thought that your election as general minister and president is a modern embodiment of that sometimes quoted passage from the biblical book of Esther. One of the only things that people quote from Esther, it seems like. You have been called for just such a time as this. One, I'd like for you to talk about that topic just in general and its importance in our own life together as a church today at this historical moment. But I also want to ask you to reflect on what ways your experience, as an embodied human being, an African American woman, you are, I believe, you're the second woman to head a communion of the World Council of Churches. Is that correct? It's always kind of hard to figure out. Because different polities have different ways of thinking. Who is our head of?
I think there are other women who became heads of communion in the World Council communion. I believe I'm the first woman of color. Maybe
you're the
first
black
woman
of color. That's what I think.
Yeah,
I think that's right. So you're the first Black woman in the world to head a major. I know. I mean, it's crazy that it's just now happening.
Right. Yeah.
But how does your your embodiment as an African American woman help you lead our church for such a time as this?
Yeah, I think I don't think as I've traveled around, I hear stories, particularly from Black disciples in particular, and even other communities of color, about their recognition of the significance of my election. And even I remember being in Grant Park the night that Barack Obama was elected president, right? You talk about heaven on earth. The streets were closed to vehicles and people in Grant Park. There's no anger, there's no rioting, there's no violence. People are literally just hugging people they don't know. There's a peace and calm on the streets of downtown Chicago that I never saw before. And yet we know that Barack faced a lot of challenges, right? It wasn't the panacea, it wasn't the silver bullet. So I'm very mindful of the fact that while my election was historic, there's still a lot of work to do. and it's the same work. I was handed a baton, and I stand on the shoulders of Sharon Watkins and Dick Ham and other people before them, Chris Hopgood and John Humbert, and even Dale Fires. I mean, all of these people. I think what my embodied identity brings to this, and I say in many different spaces, it's like, you have elected a Black woman. You cannot expect me to simply be a physically Black representation of a white perspective.
Yep.
Or to not be aware of the real presence of white superiority, white supremacy in our church. I think what my embodied experience has given me is operating in the world where I know that everybody's not like me. I am probably more attuned to experiences of oppression and frustration and injustice than other people might be, because I've personally experienced it in a lot of ways. I've experienced that people, quite honestly, will sometimes want me to respond and act in a certain way or have a particular kind of relationship with me. There's still a lot of paternalism in our church in terms of how some male leaders across the church may interact with you, and even the whole process by which, there was a new orientation process that was put in place that had never been put in place for a GMP before. And it's kind of like our executive search model, right, has this recognition that we need to be not only thinking of candidates and pools, but there's a section that says, once they're there, let's make sure we help them along. But what do we mean by that? Do you mean that, I felt in some ways like I was being oriented to say, Terri, this is the church, this is how we do it here. We want you to learn how we do it so that you could be successful, as opposed to saying, what we hope we've done is we believe God has called this person to operate in their gifts and lead us, and trusting that person is as committed to, first of all, the gospel of Jesus Christ, but also to the vision of who disciples are and who we want to be in the world, and that it may not look like what you've done before. The relationships may be different. I may have a different set of, I'm not a part of certain social networks in the church, and that's okay. I wouldn't have been part of those anyway, but to think that I have to be acceptable to certain people in order to be accepted or even successful is something that I've experienced. And I think part of my, I've been in the role 4 years now. And so you listened, you learned, and now it's time to really put forth, vision that you cast about imagination, yes, but what does that look like, and how do we move forward? In many ways, the things that we've done as Vision 2020, that, we're not going to quit planting new churches just because we reached that 1,000 mark. We're not going to quit doing leadership development. We're not going to quit being an anti-racist church. That language of the movement for wholeness in a fragmented world resonates with us. Now what we need to do, as I say, is let's be the church we say we are. Let's unpack that. What does wholeness look like? And how do we achieve that in the society? If we're a movement for wholeness, that's why the Poor People's Campaign is so important, because that's who we say we are.
Right.
We say that we're here to create wholeness for humanity as a testimony to our faith in Jesus Christ. So, for example, when I moved in, I was a pastor of a white congregation, white suburban congregation, small congregation. I was one of the youngest adults in that group. And I used to ask God, quite honestly, God, really, is this really where you want me to be? I went and was called to sort of preach and interview to be their interim pastor. And that first worship experience, I literally fell in love with these people. I didn't expect to, but there was a connection. And what I had to learn was that I had to minister to them in ways that they could understand and embrace because of who they were. And most of them were not like me. And that was probably one of the greatest lessons of my ministry. The gospel music that I grew up with, we did a lot of contemporary music in Downers Grove, but the gospel music that I grew up with, I recognized that this group of white Christians didn't necessarily connect with this idea of Jesus as liberator and conqueror and solver of my problems. And life is rough and stuff is happening to me, but Jesus is the conqueror. Jesus overcomes. That struggle with difficulty wasn't as real existentially for some of them. And I think that's part of what's happened in COVID, is that we got people who for their whole lives have lived without jobs and enough food and without adequate health care. And now this wider society is like, oh my God, we're losing our jobs. We don't have health care. How am I going to make it? And the voices of people who have been, I won't say victims, but who've experienced the unjust history of particularly the United States. It is a miracle that Black people believe in Jesus, because the gospel was used, the Bible was used to support and promote slavery. So I carry all that with me. And I think the fact that I have those experiences and I'm aware of my difference in spaces. And I think that's where white people have to get to be aware of the fact that there is difference in the world and it's not deficient. And that everything doesn't need to, we've been socialized into this sort of white norm. In order to be successful in anything I've ever done, I've had to be bilingual in that sense. Yeah. I tell people all the time, the colorism in our society, the fact that I'm a light-skinned Black woman is probably more acceptable to some white people and others. I'm so aware of that privilege because I was raised not to see it as anything that made me superior. I was raised to be aware of this colorism, but that my identity as a Black person was what shaped my worldview and how I move in the world. And the fact that Black people found that liberating Jesus, they found that liberating Jesus, despite what they were told. They latched on to those stories of the Exodus and Moses leading those people out of Egypt. They latched on to, James Cone, when King is assassinated. Cone is like, wait a minute, the prophet who preached love and beloved community, how can I be Black and Christian? How does this work? And then he's inspired by Luke 4:18, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. Jesus saying, I am here to bind up the brokenhearted, to preach the good news to the poor, to set at liberty those who are captive. I'm quoting King James because that's what I was raised with.
That's okay. That's okay.
But it's that belief in the power of Jesus Christ that's at the heart of so many communities of color who've experienced, if you're Hispanic, documentation status, the oppression of so many of our Asian communities. Historically, I had students when I was dean of students at the University of Chicago Divinity School. One of my student ministers was from Korea, loved gospel music. And I was like, so how does this work? Like, what's the connection? And she says, the connection is that gospel music speaks to the struggle of a people. And because the Koreans were occupied by Japan, yep, they resonate with those stories of trouble and oppression and liberation and Jesus being the answer, God being the answer to those things. And I think part of the message that I bring is if we could all understand that God is the answer and Jesus is our confession, that we're not just little 501c3 congregations out here doing good little things, because we could be in the junior league or a sorority or fraternity. Right. But we got to get to this point of Jesus being the answer. And getting in touch with the fact that there is oppression and injustice out there, but Jesus is the answer for us as Christians, and that to be whole church, I got to see you got to see me, and you can't see me as different and therefore deficient. And so I think that's what my life experience, I guess, and identity. I'm very clear. I joke about it, but I'm very serious to say, you elected a Black woman. That's who I am. I can't be anything other than that. My worldview, I'm married to a Black man. I raised a Black man who's married to a young woman who's half Argentine and therefore bilingual. So my family is, obviously there's been some mixing of blood in my own genealogy. But all of these differences don't diminish me at all. And you've got to learn to listen, the way I lead, the way I express myself. There's this, Michelle Obama always used to talk about, the angry Black woman, the aggressive Black woman. I get that a lot from, not that I'm angry, but, she speaks her mind. Yeah, I do. And so God bless us all. That's just who I am. And I'm as different. And so we have to take, you're different. Sharon is different. I'm not Sharon. I'm not Dick. I have to be comfortable with that. And the church has to be comfortable with that too. And as we see more and more people of color stepping into regional minister positions and leading general units, we have to understand that people's cultural and life experience shapes their theology. And it also shapes how they lead, how they build relationships. And we can't expect everything to conform to what has historically been the white norm in the church. So I'll get off that soapbox.
No, this is a wonderful soapbox for you to be on. This is inspiring, and what a wonderful way to inaugurate Disciples History podcast with this history-making general minister and president, and my pastor, our pastor, Terri Hord Owens. I tell you, I love you, Terri, and we are so blessed that you have been called to be our leader. And I want to thank you for your generosity in helping us launch this podcast.
Absolutely, Rick. Thank you. It's always a joy to talk with you. I wish you were geographically closer so that we could do it more often. And you and Sharon are always on my heart and my prayers, and I'm grateful for what your leadership means to the church, what her leadership means to the church, and what the Historical Society is doing. I think the event in Tulsa is just going to be transformative for us, and I'm really looking forward to it. And I'm grateful to you for your leadership in pulling it all together.
Thank you. All right, and we will be back on a regular basis with our podcast. And thank you so much, Terri. And God bless everybody. Thanks.